Ukraine has unveiled a new kind of robot weapon, an AI-powered gunboat that's been attacking Russian targets in the Black Sea. My name is Jerome. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. And you can now join Frontline if you'd like to get exclusive access to exclusive content, and also availability of badges and extra emojis that you can use in the comments and questions, which is such an important part of this show. You can click the link either now or at the end of the show, or if you go to The Sun's homepage, you'll see an opportunity to join Frontline. We're going to start today with these new robot weapons. The most dramatic one we've seen are these sort of drone ski jet skis. They're called the Sea Babies. They are modelled on a jet ski powered engine. These are the sorts of, these are the weapons that Ukraine has been using in the Black Sea for many, many months, years now, to sneak up to Russian warships and explode in kind of kamikaze missions. What we've also seen, and what the SBU have explicitly revealed now, is that they've mounted machine guns on top of these Sea Babies. And whilst in the past we've been led to believe that perhaps these machine guns have been remotely controlled, the SBU, Ukraine's domestic intelligence agency, has said that now they can find, track and engage targets on their own, so they don't need a human being at the end of a remote control to open fire. And this is a significant evolution. The technology's existed for a while, but there's been a sort of uneasiness among many armed forces to take what they call to take humans out of the loop, out of the kill chain. So historically there's always been a human being involved in making that decision to use lethal force. Now, there are various types of weapons where those humans have been taken out, and this appears to be one of them. So footage, dramatic footage of these drones in action, these Sea Baby drones, where you can see the sort of gun's eye view, if you like, with Russian helicopters flying across, Russian aircraft flies across, that's not engaged, and then what appears to be a sort of Russian fast patrol boat that this drone opened fires on. And that's not the only one. We've also seen recently Ukraine has said that it has commissioned the droid TW-12.7. Now, this is a tracked vehicle, more like a remote controlled vehicle, with a 50 caliber Browning machine gun mounted on its top, and that effectively can roll over the land and engage targets, leaving its soldiers a safe distance behind. Now, not clear yet whether or not this is AI, this is robotic, or whether or not it's just a remote controlled remote control car, if you like, with a machine gun on top. But clearly, if the technology exists for those drones, the technology exists for this sort of land-based vehicle. And we have seen in the air the Seika Scout drone. Now, this is a Ukrainian modified drone which can identify dozens of different types of Russian armoured vehicles and engage them. So the advantage of these systems to the Ukrainians is that once the weapon is unleashed, once it's sent on its mission, it doesn't need to communicate back and forth with the Ukrainian forces who deployed it. Now, in an intensely contested electronic warfare space where both sides are trying to jam or spoof or inhibit the other side's drones, remotely controlled or piloted vehicles, this means that these robot weapons can carry out their mission almost irrespective of the electronic warfare environment. Of course, there are electronic warfare weapons that can just bring the vehicles down or disable them where they find them, but it means they don't need that communication. And this is, in many senses, many experts suggesting that this is the direction of travel, the future of warfare. It's not going to negate the need for human beings. There will always be the need for soldiers and sort of sailors and airmen and airwomen in conflict. But this is a new evolution, and Ukraine appears to be at the cutting edge of it. There are, of course, risks. The risks is that if you're using these types of weapons in an area where there might be civilians, there's a real risk that it'd be hard for them to disambiguate, to identify what is military and what is civilian, or if a military target is close to a civilian building. For example, if a tank is parked next to a school, how does that drone know not to engage it? But what we're likely seeing is these weapons being used in areas where that risk is minimal. So, for example, on the Black Sea against Russian warships. And we understand from Ukraine's SBU, for example, that this latest wave of Sea Baby attacks went on to attack vessels near or around the Kerch Bridge. That's that really important strategic link between mainland Russia and occupied Crimea. And similarly, whilst it's unclear exactly where those Seeker Scout drones have been deployed, one would assume they've been deployed on Frontline, where there's very little chance of civilians being around. But the other risk there, of course, is that a lot of the armoured vehicles and tanks and machinery that Russia uses, Ukraine also uses. And I don't know exactly the details of how that drone might try and detect the difference between a Ukrainian or a Russian vehicle. There's some debate as well, and some of you may know this, between autonomous and automated. Where these weapons sit will be contested. Automated is essentially you give a weapon a set of parameters. If this, then that. So, for example, the anti-aircraft missiles on ships and anti-aircraft guns on ships, once they're armed, if they detect a threat incoming, then they automatically engage if that threat meets certain parameters. Autonomous is slightly different because it's that machine learning element that as they go, they take the information they have, they use it, they adapt to it, and their mission might change as a result of what they find, what they interpret. All of this comes as Ukraine continues its barrage of long-range strikes into Russia, and there have been a number of them since our last update. Most notably, perhaps, a barrage of at least 6, possibly more, ATACMS missiles at an airfield or an industrial site on the edge of an airfield in Taganrog in Russia's Rostov. Now, there is some pretty optimistic speculation and very unconfirmed at the moment that one of these missiles may have hit or have damaged one of the Ilyushin 80 aircraft. These are often referred to as the flying Kremlins, forgive me. That is the sort of command and control aircraft, a bit like Air Force One, but for Russia, that Putin might get into in the event of a nuclear conflict, and he'd be able to continue to control or command Russian forces. Now, as I said, that's very unconfirmed. What it does appear, though, is that these missiles have hit an aircraft repair facility. And among the aircraft that are likely or possibly have been repaired there are the Beriev A-50 long-range radar aircraft. Now, these are flying command and control, air traffic control aircraft, if you like, that command a battle space. They are really important. They're particularly important for helping Russia to work out what is friendly and what is not in the air. And you'll remember that Ukraine managed to shoot one of them down over the Black Sea, and then shortly after that appeared to damage one on Russian soil. That led to a significant stretch for Russia on the availability of these aircraft. They are really important. And we know that ATACMS are being used deliberately against sort of strategic, valuable targets. And an indication that this was important has come both from Russia's Ministry of Defense and today from Dmitry Peskov, who is President Putin's spokesman, both of them stressing that Russia will take retaliatory action specifically for that attack in Taganrog, because Russia believes it was carried out with US ATACMS missiles. And while we're on that, US officials, including the State Department, have indicated that they believe Russia is preparing a second strike with its intermediate range experimental ballistic missile, the Oreshnik. That was the one they used for the first time against a target in Ukraine's central city of Dnipro. These are hypersonic missiles because they reach the edge of space. They can reach speeds of around 13,000 miles per hour, although they don't maneuver that unpredictably at that speed. So not often when people refer to hypersonic missiles, actually what they mean is something slightly different, more like hypersonic sort of cruise missile or ballistic missile that can maneuver at speeds of over Mach 5. This is different, but nonetheless a very powerful weapon that Russia used to try and intimidate the West, to try and deter the West from allowing Ukraine to use these long-range missiles like ATACMS and like the Storm Shadow bunker-busting air-launched cruise missiles, which Ukraine has also had permission since November to use against targets in Russia. What else have we seen? There was a strike against an oil field in Bryansk. And there's also been dramatic footage of an explosion over what we think is a barracks, police barracks in Grozny in Chechnya. And that's a barracks controlled by the Chechen warlord and close Putin ally, Ramzan Kadyrov. He has said that a couple of roofs were damaged by this explosion, 4 people were injured, but he's vowed to take out 400 Ukrainians in vengeance for 4 of his men who were damaged. Who knows if that number of 4 injured is correct, but nonetheless, a range of long-range Ukrainian strikes. Meanwhile, what's Russia doing? Russia is continuing its grinding offensive, particularly around Pokrovsk at the moment. That's been one of the real focuses of Russia's fury. That's Pokrovsk in the southeastern part of what Ukraine still controls of Donetsk. So Russian forces have moved west from Donetsk. They've moved into Krakow. That's a town I think I've mentioned before that I was in early on in the war, where we documented cluster bomb strikes in civilian areas. The Institute for the Study of War has described what they call a sort of sweeping maneuver, a turning maneuver from the south. They're coming, so Russian forces are coming through Krakow and trying to move up towards Pokrovsk. They're now 6 kilometers away from Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk is important because it sits across a road and rail junction which Ukraine uses to supply other key parts of the front line. Interestingly, there was a briefing from Western officials on the war in Ukraine recently, and they talked about the rate of ammunition fired by both sides. At some points in this conflict, Russia has been firing easily 10 times as much artillery as Ukraine. Sometimes apparently that ratio has been 13-1. At the moment, it appears to have dropped. It's almost level. It's not quite 1-for-1. Apparently, it's 1.5-1. So for every one shell or rocket that Ukraine fires, Russia is firing 1.5, 1.5 times as many. And that's probably still feels like a big difference if you're on the receiving end of it. But it's significant because it may, or it likely, reflects Ukraine's successful strikes against Russian ammunition depots. And you remember there have been some really dramatic strikes, particularly against a depot that was housing huge quantities, we believe, of North Korean artillery shells that have been shipped in from Pyongyang. Pyongyang supplying up to 3 million shells a year now. Western officials believe that's around half Russia's total consumption. Now, as ever, thank you very much for your questions. If you do have any questions, please do make them in the comments below. And of course, if you've joined Frontline, then that's going to make it much easier for us to see your questions and for other people to see that you are a member, for all of us to respond and get involved in that conversation more quickly and more actively. If you do join Frontline, of course, you're also going to get access to exclusive content. And in today's exclusive update, we're going to be talking about French-led plans, but which other allies have supported, to send NATO forces into Ukraine. 3 questions I'm going to answer today. One of them is about warthogs. This is a question that comes up again and again. It's why is America not giving its A-10 tank-busting Warthog aircraft to Ukraine? The simple answer is that Ukraine has not asked for them. Ukraine does not appear to want them. The more nuanced answer, and this upsets some advocates of the A-10, is that this is an old aircraft that would be incredibly vulnerable to the sort of relatively abundant air defences, surface-to-air missiles, guided missiles and more sophisticated air defence systems, so shoulder-launched air defence missiles and more sophisticated longer-range air defence systems, which Russia has across the front line. So the A-10s are fantastic aircraft. They have been used to great effect in previous conflicts where America's been fighting, but Ukraine hasn't asked for them. One of you made the really good point, which is that peace will take a long time, comparing it to conflicts, for example, how long it took to negotiate an end to the war in Vietnam. That is likely, and we were talking last week about how there appears to be a shift in the mood music around Ukraine, increased appetite for peace talks, potentially from both sides, but certainly NATO Secretary General, Britain's Prime Minister, all of them sort of talking about getting Ukraine into the strongest position for those talks. Crucially, as Ukraine has pointed out, the Kremlin hasn't shown any appetite for those talks, and while Zelensky has said that he might be willing to freeze the conflict, which would ultimately mean ceding some territory in exchange for NATO guarantees, there are NATO members, a number of NATO members, Hungary, most recently Luxembourg, I think Slovakia as well, saying that they're not ready to admit Ukraine into NATO. So that option which Zelensky's put on the table doesn't appear really at the moment to be viable. Final question today is, how did I work out that Ukraine's losses are unsustainable? I use that phrase because we were talking about the rate that soldiers are being killed and wounded versus the rate that both sides who are losing soldiers are able to replace them. And I was repeating what I have been told by senior Western officials, former generals, but those still very closely involved with the military institutions which are supporting Ukraine. And they made it very clear, and this isn't really disputed, that Russia is managing, despite its eye-watering losses, to recruit more people than it is losing, and Ukraine is not. Now, fundamentally, if Ukraine cannot or is not replacing the soldiers that it is losing, that is unsustainable, because if every day or every week or every month they have fewer soldiers in the fight, ultimately that line leads us to zero. Now, it's not linear and it's unlikely to go in that direction, but I should point out that I saw Britain's former Defence Secretary Ben Wallace at an event at Chatham House this week, and he was asked about what more the West can do for Ukraine. And he talked about, he said, if President Zelensky was to mobilise 1 million people and, say, train them, his argument was that the West, Ukraine's Western allies could do that. Now, it wouldn't mean that 1 million people went straight back into the fight. He said they could go back, they could put their helmet under their beds and, wait for the call-up. But he was arguing that it was a good display of sort of resilience, or not resilience, but a good display of resolve, both the West's resolve and Ukraine's resolve. President Zelensky has stopped short of ordering a sort of mass mobilization compulsory draft. What they've got is a situation where once you reach a certain age bracket, you are eligible for the draft, and some people, a limited number of people, are being called up. Some would argue not enough. Ben Wallace commented on, quite rightly, that one of Zelensky's concerns is the effect this would have on the economy. That's the same concerns that President Putin has if he's stopped short of ordering sort of massive compulsory draft mobilization, because that would also take too many people potentially out of the Russian economy and out of the Ukrainian economy and exacerbate the problems that both countries are facing economically. I hope I've answered your questions. If you've got any more, please do ask them in the comments below. And as I said, don't forget, you can now join Frontline. There should be a link on the video, or you can go to the Sun's homepage on YouTube and there's a link there to join Frontline. Look forward to seeing you again next week.